In December of 1940, Britain was still standing, but barely. From the outside, it looked like defiance. On maps, the British Empire was still painted in confident pink, stretching across continents. From Canada to India, from Africa to the Pacific, it appeared unshakable. But appearances were lying. Beneath the surface, Britain was drowning, not just in bombs, but in debt. German aircraft filled the night skies over London. Entire neighborhoods vanished in firestorms. Coventry burned. Liverpool burned. Families slept in underground stations while the Blitz tore the capital apart. The Battle of Britain had been won in the air, but the war was far from over. Inside the underground war rooms beneath Whitehall, Britain's leaders faced a reality they could never admit publicly. The empire was going broke. Not slowly. Not eventually. It was running out of money right now. And without money, modern war was impossible. Winston Churchill understood this better than anyone. His speeches gave Britain courage. His words echoed around the world. But even Churchill knew that courage alone could not buy aircraft engines, oil, steel, or ammunition. So in the winter of 1940, he sat down to write a letter, one that would change global history. It was addressed to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States. And buried beneath its diplomatic language was a confession so dangerous it could never be spoken aloud. Britain was bankrupt. To understand how shocking this was, you have to understand who Britain had been before the war. For more than a century, Britain wasn't just an empire, it was the financial center of the world. London was global banking. British investors owned railways in South America, mines in Africa, factories in the United States. The pound sterling was trusted everywhere. When the war began in 1939, Britain still held enormous gold reserves. It had foreign investments worth billions. On paper, it was rich. But Hitler's war wasn't fought with muskets and marching armies. It was a war of machines, tanks, aircraft, submarines, fuel, aluminum, rubber, steel, and Britain had a fatal weakness. It imported almost everything. Once Nazi Germany dominated continental Europe, Britain was cut off from nearby suppliers. Food, fuel, raw materials, nearly all of it had to come across the Atlantic. And across that Atlantic sat the United States. Officially neutral, economically powerful, politically cautious. America was willing to sell weapons, but only on its terms. Those terms were brutal. U.S. neutrality laws allowed Britain to buy weapons under one condition: cash and carry. No loans. No credit. No sympathy. Britain had to pay in dollars, immediately, and transport everything using its own ships. For a time, Britain complied. Gold flowed out of the country. In a secret mission known as Operation Fish, Britain shipped nearly its entire gold reserve across the Atlantic to Canada for safekeeping and spending. It was the largest transfer of physical wealth in history. Crates of gold bars crossed submarine-infested waters just to keep Britain fighting. But war consumes money faster than anyone expects. By late 1940, the gold was gone. British purchasing agents in Washington stared at contracts they could no longer sign. London sent back the same message again and again. There are no dollars left. That was the moment Churchill's letter landed on Roosevelt's desk. Roosevelt understood exactly what it meant. If Britain fell, America would eventually stand alone. But he also faced a problem. The American public didn't want another war. And Congress absolutely refused to give Britain free money. So Roosevelt needed a workaround, something that sounded generous, but protected American interests. That workaround became known as Lend-Lease. Publicly, Roosevelt explained Lend-Lease with a folksy metaphor. If your neighbor's house is on fire, he said, you don't sell him a hose. You lend it to him. It sounded neighborly, reasonable, moral. But behind closed doors, the tone was very different. The U.S. Treasury, led by Henry Morgenthau Jr., made its position crystal clear. Before America helped Britain, Britain had to prove it had nothing left. Not almost nothing. Everything. Morgenthau demanded a complete financial audit of the British Empire. Every government asset. Every private investment. Every overseas holding. British negotiators were stunned. They weren't being treated like allies. They were being treated like a bankrupt company in receivership. And the message was unmistakable. Sell first. Britain protested. It argued that selling long-term investments during wartime would mean fire sale prices. That it would cripple the post-war economy. That it would leave the country unable to rebuild. Washington was unmoved. If Britain still owned valuable assets in America, then, in the American view, the U.S. taxpayer should not foot the bill. And so the sell-off began. The most symbolic sacrifice was a company called American Viscose. It was a massive industrial firm, the largest rayon producer in the United States, and it was British-owned. Profitable. Strategic. Valuable. To British officials, it was untouchable. To Morgenthau, it was leverage. The ultimatum was simple. Sell American Viscose, or Lend-Lease dies in Congress. Under immense pressure, the British government seized the company and forced its sale. Everyone knew Britain had no choice. Investment bankers drove the price down mercilessly. A company worth over $100 million was sold for barely half that. The dollars went straight to the U.S. Treasury. The losses stayed with Britain. It was a turning point. Britain realized something chilling. This wasn't cooperation. It was asset extraction. Money wasn't the only thing Britain lacked. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than Britain could replace them. Food and fuel were disappearing beneath the waves. Churchill begged Roosevelt for destroyers, old World War I ships sitting idle in American ports. Roosevelt agreed. But again, nothing was free. In exchange for 50 aging destroyers, the United States demanded 99-year leases on British bases across the Atlantic and Caribbean, from Newfoundland to Jamaica to Trinidad. Britain handed over strategic control of entire regions, not permanently, but long enough to reshape global power. It was survival in exchange for influence. And Britain signed. By 1945, the war was won. Crowds filled London streets. Bonfires burned. The empire celebrated survival. But in Washington, sentimentality had no place. Just days after victory in Japan, President Truman terminated Lend-Lease. Immediately. No transition. No warning. Ships carrying food and supplies were ordered to turn around mid-ocean. Britain was stunned. Its economy had been completely restructured for war. It produced weapons, not exports. It relied entirely on American supplies. Now the lifeline was gone. John Maynard Keynes looked at the numbers and saw catastrophe. Britain was bankrupt instantly. There was only one option left. Beg. Keynes traveled to Washington, sick and exhausted, hoping to argue for fairness. He asked for a grant, payment for the years Britain had stood alone against Hitler. The answer was no. There would be no gift, only a loan, with interest, and with conditions. The most dangerous condition was sterling convertibility, forcing Britain to allow anyone holding pounds to exchange them for US dollars. Keynes knew exactly what would happen. And he was right. When convertibility began in 1947, the world dumped sterling overnight. Britain's reserves vanished in weeks. The government slammed the window shut in humiliation. The empire was finished. The long shadow of victory. Britain devalued its currency. Austerity followed. Rationing continued into peace. And the debt lingered. The final payment on Britain's wartime loan was made in 2006, more than 60 years after the war ended. Britain won the war. But it paid for that victory with its empire, its economy, and its future. The empire didn't collapse. It was sold, piece by piece. To survive.